the region system not willing to share, or is there a possibility that there's a barrier that will not allow them legally at this point to share, or do you not know that yet?
I think I heard your question. There is a tendency to take self-ownership of some of these buildings, and maybe it needs to be. Maybe the logistics won't allow them to open these facilities, or they don't have the ticket master, so to speak, to manage them, and from a logistical and a security standpoint. But in the South Georgia areas, I went to visit a lot of the colleges below the Nat line, and some of these places were the community centers. I went to Waycross College, and they have a facility there that they welcome the community in, and I just think it's something that needs to be looked at statewide if we could.
Yeah. Any questions from the committee? Anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Actually, the resolution. What's the pleasure of the committee on the resolution?
I have a motion to do pass.
Motion to do pass. Do we have a second?
Second.
Well, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, like sign. Looks like it moves.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Chairman, members.
Okay, next we're gonna take a look at resolution 1492. Representative Buckner, come and explain your resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. I appreciate the opportunity to present this piece of legislation to you today. This is a resolution calling for a study committee to look at the salaries, benefits, and overall working environment of those courageous men and women who serve in our state parole as state parole and probation officers. Needless to say, they serve the public in a great capacity. We just simply, as a state, have not looked at this in a serious manner in quite some time. We've fallen behind in this area in doing right by these state employees, and I'm just hopeful that we can get an opportunity for the House of Representatives to put some serious thought into where we are in the process of looking after these good citizens.
Okay, it was just reading through your resolution. How does it call as far as the appointments to the membership?
It is a House study committee. The Speaker of the House will appoint 5 members, and there is a maximum of 5 days that they can serve.
Okay. Any questions from the committee? I'm sure that Assistant Commissioner Owens wants to speak on this. Would you like to come tell us your thoughts on it?
I'll be brief, but so often this committee knows the general public, when they think about the Department of Corrections, only thinks about the state prison system and forgets that we have almost 800 probationers out there supervising felony probationers across the state of Georgia. We have approximately 800 probation officers responsible for the supervision of 135,000 felony offenders. So we certainly appreciate the representatives concerned about our probation officers. I think I can speak on behalf of our colleagues at the parole board too. They do essentially the same job under difficult circumstances. So we would certainly appreciate to provide any information that you all need over the summer during the study committee. And again, I just want to thank the representative for bringing this forward.
Okay. Anyone else wishing to speak on the resolution? Yes, come ahead. And you just give the committee your name.
My name is James Rawls, and I'm with the State Board of Pardon and Parole, and I'd just like to agree with what Mr. Owens has said, and we really appreciate the efforts of Representative Buckner to bring these issues to the front burner. And again, any information that we can provide that will be of assistance to the committee, just give us a call. We provide it right away.
Absolutely. Appreciate the comments. Hopefully we can move this on through the House, and I look forward to seeing that committee set up in the interim, and maybe it'll be the locomotive that gets the whole train moving eventually.
Good. Thank you.
What's the pleasure of the committee? We're going to move to pass in a second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. House Resolution 1492 by due pass. Thank you, Ms. Buckner. Thank you. Now, Representative Brian Thomas has House Bill 1402, which seems to have drawn a good bit of attention today, Representative Thomas. if you'll come and explain your bill. And since it is a little bit lengthy, if you don't mind, would you just basically go through the whole bill and tell us what you're doing and how you originated it? And I think there's some others that wish to speak or address the bill as well. You may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I bring to you today House Bill 1402 for your consideration, and just want to first upfront tell you what the bill intends to accomplish, then we'll walk through the bill, and then I'll provide you with a little supplemental information so you can understand the context of it. What the bill does is it will require the state to use sustainable building standards whenever state money is being used to build buildings. So that would apply to state agencies, to the university system, and to school districts if that money is originating from the state and not just local funds. There's a term that you're going to hear in this discussion, LEED, L-E-E-D, and what that stands for is Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And what LEED is it's a rating system that has been developed by a private entity called U.S. Green Building Council. And it has a series of categories that you essentially have a point system set up where you gain certain number of points when you achieve certain types of outcomes in your design and construction of a building. And just to give you a sense of what that is, I'm just going to read off the 6 categories that are evaluated in this. Those are sustainable sites, water efficiency, energy and atmosphere, materials and resources, indoor environmental quality, and innovation and design process. And the way LEED works is that there are different levels of certification based on how many points you get in these various categories. Now, green building construction or sustainability construction programs have been adopted in a number of states, either through legislation directly or through an executive order by the governor. And those states include Washington, California, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Minnesota, Maine, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. So there's certainly a lot of state precedent for this type of an approach. Mr. Chairman, what I'd like to do now is just walk through the bill and explain its components so everybody on the committee understands what we're hoping to achieve with this.
Before you do that, Representative Thomas, would you restate yourself on the states that you just mentioned? What type, as far as the states you just mentioned, how involved are they in sustainability standards? Can you give us a little bit more information on the states you just mentioned?
I can give you some information and be happy to provide you with more details afterwards. There are several states that have passed laws that require specifically LEED certification on buildings. Others, and I'd say the majority of this group, have developed sustainability standards that they are requiring state construction projects, any state buildings, to adhere to. So that there is a mix in some cases, and I think there are 3 or 4 states that actually have legislation that have enabled this. In the other states, there is an executive order that essentially the governor has told state agencies that you will comply with sustainability standards.
Okay, thanks so much.
And the LC number that I have is LC 254395. Is that what the committee has? Okay, great. On the first page, we're down into definitions, essentially at the bottom, beginning in line 19, and this describes what high-performance building is, and also defines what LEED Silver Standard means, and references back to the U.S. Green Building Council Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, which is what I just described briefly. On page 2, at line 1, you see what a major facility project means, and that is any construction project larger than 5,000 square feet of occupied or conditioned space. So it would not be applicable to storage space, for example. A major facility project does not include several things, and these are important to point out. First is a project that the state property officer and the design team determine that state sustainability standards are not practicable. So it's important that there's a lot of flexibility here in whether or not something is going to be required, a building is going to be required to have these state sustainability standards used in its construction. Also on line 6, it excludes certain small buildings, and it lists a couple of examples here, and the state property officer has the flexibility to also define what types of buildings we're not even going to consider as major facility projects. Moving down, I think the most important definition is on line 15, that's number 6, what we mean by state sustainability standards. And the language in here says that this will mean LEED Silver Standard, which is one of the certification standards under LEED, or some other building standards that provide environmental and sustainability standards comparable to the LEED Silver Standard. And this is an important definition because we are not necessarily going to require that LEED Silver Standard be the standard adopted in the state of Georgia. As I'll point out below, the state property officer has the requirement to develop standards, and those will become the standard. And that can be LEED Silver, or it can be some other standards that the state property officer develops. Moving further down the page, line 19, give you some information about the State Properties Commission will be the ones that actually promulgate regulations for this, because they do have that authority already. And that the, let's see, and then line 23, all major facility projects of the state agencies shall be designed, constructed, and certified to at least the state sustainability standards. So this is an important component of the law, that we are essentially saying that all major facility projects will meet state sustainability standards. And there's a caveat to that on line 27 and 8, to the extent that appropriate state sustainability standards exist for that type of building or facility. So again, there's some leeway here, so that we're not, the intent of this is not to tie the hands and say you must do this in all cases. There's a lot of flexibility built into this bill to allow flexibility where it's necessary. At the bottom of the page, I'll just highlight lines 34 through 36. This sets up a required feedback mechanism so that we in the legislature understand how this is being implemented, and furthermore, whether it has the intended success that is anticipated if this should become law. Moving over to page 3, I'm going to skip down to line 12 and under paragraph B. And again, what this section of the bill would do is it has a feedback mechanism by ensuring that there's effort to evaluate and train the end users in the requirements here, and also an evaluation feedback mechanism so that the state property officer is receiving the information necessary to evaluate the efficacy of this approach. And this is done through the creation of an advisory committee, which will have representatives from the design and construction industry, public work contractors, and so forth. So we'll get a lot of on-the-ground feedback from the folks that are out there implementing these policies, and the business interests that are also involved. So again, there's this mechanism, feedback mechanism, so that we can evaluate how we're doing. The next several sections essentially go through the definitions again, defining what a major facility project is. The first, section 2, that begins on the bottom of page 3, essentially is the same language, but it makes it applicable to the Department of Education. So the first section deals with state agencies, with the state property officer overseeing that requirement. And the next two sections, section 2 deals with the Department of Education and mirrors, for the most part, the language in the previous portion of the bill. Again, defines what a major facility project is, has the same caveats, the same flexibility in how we're going to define those things. It also talks about what types of projects are required to meet the state sustainability standards, and that's on beginning on line 10. Line 16, it has a requirement that the projects that are built under these sustainability standards be monitored and documented, so we know whether we're actually getting value out of this approach. Because if it doesn't work, we don't want to do it. Certainly the data out there suggests it does in fact work, but we want to make sure it's working here. We're not going to use other people's data to evaluate that. On line 23, it gives the state school superintendent the responsibility of consolidating these reports, whereas at the state agency level, it's the state property officer. Moving to page 5, section 3, again, mirroring the same types of requirements, but now it makes it applicable to the university system of Georgia. Again, the same flexibility is built in the definitions. There are caveats in there that if doing it is not practical as determined by the university system and the design team, then it's not a requirement to use the standards. Just in the reporting requirements, the university system, just like the superintendent of education, would be required to in an annual report, explain why they didn't use them in that case, just so we understand why. Turning to page 6, again, lines 7 through 14, that paragraph talks about the reporting requirements, and then again, beginning on line 11, you see the language that any reasons why the state sustainability standards were not used as required in this code have to be explained, and it also provides an opportunity for making recommendations about the ongoing implementation of the standards. And section 4 is another feedback mechanism. This tasks the Budgetary Responsibility Oversight Committee, which is a legislatively defined joint committee, House and Senate committee, has oversight over the bill. Make sure that what we're doing makes sense, that we're being accountable for the goals that we set forth in the law by reviewing the reports that are going to be submitted by the state property officer and the DOE and the university system. So that is the nuts and bolts of the bill, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to briefly outline some reasons why I think this is a good thing for the state of Georgia and why I'd ask for your support on the bill. First, I'm talking just briefly about the business case for it, because we are talking about a lot of money here, and it's important that as citizens and legislators, we are seriously accounting for the money we're spending. Studies indicate that it costs somewhere generally 1 to 3% of what it would cost to construct without using sustainability standards, or at least some of the LEED standards, because that's really where the data come from. There are examples where buildings cost more than that, but generally, based on the research that I've done over the last 3 or 4 months, it's generally a range of 1 to 3%. In thinking in terms of life cycle costs of a building, those costs tend to be recovered rather quickly, generally 5 to 6 years. And that recovery is based primarily on reaping savings in energy efficiency. So your utility costs drop rather dramatically, sometimes 25%. I've seen studies up to 33, 37% lower costs in energy consumption if buildings are using these sustainability standards. There's also reduced costs in water usage because they're designed to be much more efficient in the use of water. Just to give you a couple of examples from Georgia state construction, DNR has 5 buildings that are LEED certified buildings. They estimate that their upfront costs were 1 to 2% more than if they had just gone conventional construction. And GDOT recently completed a 67,000 square foot district administration office in Thomaston. They estimated that it was about 5% premium on construction upfront costs and another 1.4% in design costs. So here you're looking at about 6.5% more money upfront. They expect a 3 to 5 year payback period for that additional cost. Then, of course, after that, we just continue to save money. So a couple of Georgia examples, just so you understand sort of how it works in. I do have a fiscal note, which, Mr. Chairman, have you received that fiscal note? Okay. And you'll note in there that they used a range of 2 to 11% and gave a corresponding dollar figure to those. I'm sure there are individual buildings that may cost 11% more, but based on the research I have done, that's definitely an outlier in terms of percentage of upfront costs. And in most cases, as I said, those costs are being paid off over about a 5-year period. Other benefits are they create building according to these sustainability standards creates a healthier environment in the building itself. And based on a number of studies, and I'll quote a U.S. Department of Energy study on this one, productivity and worker health improvement in green buildings led to savings in healthcare costs ranging anywhere from 9 to 20% because of reduced illnesses because of the better ventilation in these buildings. Allergy and asthma-related problems fell as much as 18 to 25% in these buildings. Now, these were commercial buildings, not state buildings, but we obviously have the same issues in terms of indoor quality. On an education benefit that I think is important to highlight, studies have indicated that students in green buildings have an increased amount of natural daylight in their classrooms, and the test scores in those green buildings improved anywhere from 7 to 18% over schools that did not have a similar amount of daylight. So there's some serious benefits to the state in terms of energy conservation, cost savings, improved health, and student performance that I think really makes this a very, very valuable approach that I recommend to the committee. At this point, Mr. Chairman, I'd happy to answer any questions if I can.
Thank you, Representative Thomas. Is there any questions from the committee?
I have one. Thank you, Mr. Thomas, and that was a great presentation. Looking at the fiscal note when it's saying that 56 school systems have submitted an application for outlay money in 2007, by implementing this, time is of essence in some of these fast-growing areas like where I live, permits, planning, zoning, construction, DOT. Would this possibly add a layer of, when I say bureaucracy or time delay, having to go through this process, see if it's feasible, then design it? Or would this all kind of mesh, coincide, flow through just a simple process, or do you see a kind of a permit process? Well, we're in the process of studying your location. How long will it take to study? Things of that nature.
Well, it's hard to answer it, without knowing specific cases. Obviously, school systems in counties that are growing, like mine as well, Gwinnett County, we seem to be building a school every other day. The sites are limited. You can only build where you can actually acquire enough property to do that. So the process is going to be the same. The sustainability standards are going to be there. So when the school is hiring a firm, they're going to, as part of that solicitation, they're going to indicate that these standards need to be part of your bid. So it's not really something, it's not a regulatory type of set of roadblocks. It's just part of the same design process that's going to take place already. So I don't see this as being something that's going to slow any of these projects down. Clearly, it's going to be easier in larger metro area counties and urban counties to find people who understand, architects, design firms that understand the sustainability standards because they've already worked with them. That may be more challenging in rural counties, although those counties are not the counties that are building schools at the same pace. But I think that's the reality of it.
Representative Thomas, we've had this conversation, and I just need to raise the question, but it's been brought to my attention that if indeed the LEED silver standard were used, and it was a purely LEED standard, that according to the information that I've been provided, the LEED standards do not acknowledge like sustainable forestry initiatives or the American Tree Farms, that those products are not considered certified wood products that could be used for LEED. And those are major forestry initiatives in our state, and forestry is a huge industry in our state.
Absolutely.
So we don't want to do something, although we want sustainable buildings and we want them energy efficient and all of that, we don't want to do something that would hurt another industry in our state if at all possible. How could we manage that and still do what we would like to do with this bill?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question. There's some things I should point out. First, the bill requires the state property officer to provide State Property Commission recommendations on what the sustainability standards will be. that process is already in place. The state property officer has been working on some sustainability standards. I have every reason to believe that those will end up being the standards that the state adopts. But to answer your question, should for some reason it becomes LEED Silver standard that gets adopted, we're not requiring LEED certification in this bill. We're requiring the state to adopt standards. So the standards will be there, and there is no requirement that we actually get certified according to the way this bill is written. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you're looking at the LEED, the way you get points in LEED, yes, using certified lumber is one way to get 1 point. But there are other ways to get points, and one of those ways is to use local building products, of which we have an endless supply in terms of lumber in our state. So you can still use local lumber and get a point, and I think in some cases it's 2 points, for using local products that we're not there having to transport from out of state and garner those points. So I don't really see the issue of certified lumber as being problematic here along those lines, but I certainly appreciate the question on that.
Representative Thomas, just curious, you had referenced the fiscal note. And I believe I heard in your presentation that it's your feeling that the upfront cost is what, 6.5%. So are you pretty much in agreement that this 2 to 11%? You're putting your upfront cost somewhere in the middle between the 2 to 11% upfront cost. Is that?
Most of the studies that have been done on LEED buildings that I have read suggest 1 to 3% is the average. Now, there always are, there are outliers, and I referenced that Georgia DOT building, which, combined was about 6.5% for that building. DNR's buildings, and they've built 5 of them, averaged about 1 to 2% upfront costs. So, based on the research that I have done, I would assume about a 3%, 2 to 3% upfront cost. But even in the Georgia DOT's example, where again they had 6.5%, they expect a payback period in 3 to 5 years. So, I know it's challenging because we have to put the money up front, and we think about dollars when we have to allocate them. But when you think life cycle of these buildings, there's going to be tremendous savings, as you move through the 50-year life cycle of these buildings. So, but my estimate would be about 2 to 3% in terms of upfront costs.
Do you actually have the locations of the 5 DNR buildings you referenced? Do you have those available?
I'm not sure I have the locations.
That's okay. You can get that for
okay.
us, and not necessarily now. You can get that back to the committee. We'd be interested to know,
sure.
So maybe we could inspect maybe some of those buildings, get a little better, a clearer visual understanding of what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Any further questions for the representatives? I think there's some others that want to address the bill at this time. We may actually call you back if you want to sort of.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. Okay. Okay, I have a list of names here. I'm not sure if there's any particular order you guys want to travel in, but I've spoken briefly with Mr. Woodall, Mark Woodall, if he'd like to come and address the committee at this time.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Mark Woodall with Associated General Contractors. You messed me up. I wanted to clean up after Greg.
Okay.
That's okay.
Should I let Greg go first then?
No, sir. He asked me. I shouldn't have signed up before you, should I?
I'm afraid he's going to get the cleanup after you today. Go ahead.
I want to thank the sponsor for bringing this issue to you, and I also want to thank the sponsor for contacting the industry and the stakeholders on this issue. Again, I represent commercial general contractors, and we have been working together with our partners, design partners, architects and engineers for some time on this topic. And I've had to have Greg and my friends with AIA have to dumb this down for me occasionally so I can get my arms around it. But I want to explain a little bit some of the terms that you've heard about. Sustainability. Your question, Representative Cole, was an excellent question because it would be impacted if there was a certification requirement. But sustainability, what we are looking at, and actually the governor and his new Georgia Commission came out, that we are no longer just looking at upfront capital costs to design and build that project. We need to be looking at our life cycle cost of that building. In some instances, where we're building Board of Regents and things like that, these buildings are 30 and 40 and 50-year-old buildings. And so the notion that it may cost a little bit more money up front with that initial capital cost, but over the life cycle of that building, you're actually going to be saving monies because you've got efficiencies with maintenance. If you're talking about a mechanical system that Mr. Johnson designs, if something's energy efficient over a period of time, you're going to recoup that initial investment. So where we have been, as the contractors, as AGC, is we've said, when it makes sense from a cost-benefit analysis to do this, the state ought to look long and hard on implementing a sustainability program to do this. And that's where we've been on this program. You've heard a little bit about the range of cost. The program that spoke to in this bill, the LEED, and he's talking about LEED Silver, there are different ratings from this program. There's a LEED base certification, and there's a total of 68 points, 69 points. That is your lower level certification. The next one up is a silver, the next one up is a gold, and the next one up is a platinum. And as you go up for those different ratings, your cost is going to go up. And again, contractors believe, again, it's appropriate to do a cost-benefit analysis to make a decision, should we invest that upfront money because we're going to get a dividend on the back end of it. There's a benefit to the citizens of Georgia. We would suggest on almost all of your state projects, it doesn't make sense to start climbing up that ladder with the rating system. I will tell you, within the rating system, some of the things you can get points for are things like putting grass on your roof, having a LEED certified consultant submit your information. So those are some items that we would have a problem with. But again, we support, we had a joint policy statement, we went around and around and around to do this. The architects, contractors, and engineers support the notion that the state of Georgia should have a state sustainability policy. It's good business. The only other thing that again, one of our major concerns that we would mandate that LEED is the certification program. The sponsor has put in their LEED or LEED type program. There are other programs that are out there. The only thing that I would caution, I'm not sure that we're there yet, ready to do this, but we have very sophisticated, knowledgeable owners within the state ranks, particularly with JISVIC and the Board of Regents. I submit to you, our local school boards aren't ready for this. You get into your rural jurisdictions in that part of the state, LEED means the guy that's in the front of the race at NASCAR taking the checkered flag. They've got no idea. So this is something that you need a lot of input. I think the advisory committee is a great idea, getting folks that deal with this on a regular basis, and we certainly want to be at the table and assist in this effort in any way possible. And I'd be happy to try and answer any questions.
Appreciate that. Well, you mentioned those levels. You had mentioned silver, gold, platinum. What are the 2 levels or 3 levels under silver?
I believe it's just a base certification.
They're certified. There's 69 total points available. If you have between 26 and 32, that's base certified. Silver is 33 to 38. Gold 39 to 51. Platinum 52 to 69.
Okay. Any questions from the committee, Mr. Woodall? Let me ask you again for clarification. I might have been thinking of something else when you were mentioning using the word LEED. Were you stating that you thought LEED was the proper, from a contractor's perspective, proper mechanism to use, or did you state that there may be others that we should look at?
There are definitely others. LEED started this movement, and they're 2 laps ahead of everybody else. I think our position would be if people are under contract with the state and there is a sustainability standard that's been adopted for that type of projects by the state, then certainly we don't need to expend additional funds to actually have it certified by somebody that you did what you were contractually obligated to do.
Yeah.
And in some instances, It's the difference of putting the plaque out on the building. Yeah, we've got this platinum certification by LEED, and it's a marketing tool. It's something that some, particularly in the private sector, they want to do because of their environmental consciousness and also marketing to an environmental community. But we'll keep coming back as contractors that it needs to make sense from a cost-benefit analysis before you expend any additional funds.
Representative Reese.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing that does concern me here is the statement that the Department of Education would have to employ a person in the Facilities Division to oversee all this with 56 school systems planning on building. And I fail to understand why the Department of Education would have to oversee that. It seems like State Property's person could see that the architect and the contractor were following whatever standards are set. But when you said that the schools are not ready for this, I think in all areas of the state we're looking at conserving all we can as far as water, energy, and extending the life of our buildings. And our school boards now are using architects, big company architects, rather than local folks pretty much for their major construction there. So I still think it could apply to the new schools. Because, your major architect should be aware of these standards.
And again, I think the appropriate question was asked by Representative Cole. And in that section of the bill, there's not a certification required. There appears to be a certification required for the state, which has the capacity to do that type of work. Gwinnett County school system is the largest in the state. Mr. Steele, who runs that program, is one of the most knowledgeable and capable public owners in the state. They would have no problem implementing this. When you get into the rural parts, particularly of South Georgia, if the school board or the school is required to administer that, I question their knowledge of this product and this system to do so. If it's a architect that's familiar with it and everything, you're probably right. They would be able to do that under their contract as providing architectural services. Long and short, we think the state ought to lead on this. They ought to be the ones that do this, and they have the capacity now, and it ought to probably filter down from the folks from the state example.
You also have to wonder what type of fiscal impact it does present to the local county governments as well, if you're looking at their portion of cost as well. Okay, no other questions. I appreciate that. I'm going to ask Mr. Johnson to come.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here with you today and discuss this issue. I do think it's extremely important. I'm here as a private citizen first because I think it's a very important issue that the public in many ways is, I think, ahead of legislators and some of the other folks that have to implement this type of process. Secondly, I'm an engineer with about 35 years practice in Georgia in designing buildings, mostly mechanical and electrical systems over this time period. And I am a LEED accredited professional, which is a standard that LEED establishes for determining qualifications to do design and meet the LEED criteria. Just for your information, you might want to write this down where you can find out, this website where you can find out more information about LEED, usgbc.org. It's United States Green Building Council. And under there you can go to LEED, and there's a wealth of information that you can find out about the LEED process. Thirdly, I'm representing the American Council of Engineering Companies here in Georgia. I'm not a lobbyist, but Tom Leslie asked me to come today since I had a fair amount of experience in this area. And the ACEC has 300-plus member engineering firms that do most of the design in Georgia, as I'm sure you're already aware. 1,200-plus professional engineers who are designers for most of the work in Georgia. I commend Representative Thomas and his associates for putting together this bill. They've done an outstanding job, in my opinion. The time is right for the state legislature to step forward and establish sustainability standards in our state. All you have to do is look at your gas bill from October to January to know that I'm speaking the truth. Our energy usage has just gotten to be totally unrealistic for the average person, the average public citizen, and they are concerned about it. Many people, friends of mine, showed me their gas bill and said, what are we going to do about this? So a great deal of that is in energy conservation issues that can be implemented particularly effectively on new construction. Secondly, and this has been in the news and in the legislature for the last year or two, but we don't think about it that often, is water usage, an extremely critical and important issue for the future growth of our state. We've got to do something about our water consumption, and this is detailed, discussed in the LEED process. Third, the qualified firms that are familiar with and knowledgeable in the LEED process or in sustainability design in general. Georgia has the second largest group of certified LEED professionals in the United States. The last time I looked at the website, California, I believe, is the only state in the number of qualified individuals that exceeds those in Georgia. So we have lots of firms and lots of design professionals that are in detail familiar with the process. The state agencies, I think, have dealt with this to some extent. As Mr. Woodall mentioned, the Department of Natural Resources has done some work in this area, and their buildings is kind of pilot projects. And some of the other state agencies have moved to begin the process, but I think they're a little bit nervous in terms of doing something because they are concerned about the costs, and they are concerned about what they have to do with the money that you allocate a budget to them. And they feel like it's easy to go back to the old way of doing things, say, I need square footage, but in the long term, we pay for that as a taxpayer. The buildings that we have in Georgia, public buildings that this bill addresses, have an average life expectancy of well beyond the 30 years. We just renovated some state buildings that are already 40 years old, and Gina Abrams wanted us to keep them for another 25 or 30 years. So that may be a bit of an extreme, but a lot of these public buildings are going to be there for 30 or 40 years, and we need to think about that. And as Mr. Woodall said, look at the life cycle cost aspects of this. Life cycle costing has been around for a while, but it hadn't been really implemented because emphasis hasn't been placed on it for the designers. This LEED process mandates that you go through the life cycle costing analysis. I think we've already discussed basically the outline for LEED. As we mentioned, there's 5 areas: water consumption, energy usage, indoor air quality, an extremely critical area for our public citizens and employees, the materials that we use in the building for building construction, the recycling of those materials, and the site. Just looking at the location and the orientation of the building is extremely critical to minimizing the impact on the environment and to reducing the energy consumption. This is a very good bill, in my opinion, for basically 3 reasons. It sets a sustainability standard that is to be managed by the state agencies, the overall 3 big agencies that are indicated in the bill. And yet it provides flexibility in the specific details. It says LEED or equivalent standard. I think that's very important. And those named offices for these large state, the Department of Education, Regents, and GSFIC, the property officer, have the responsibility to implement this process. So there's some flexibility in there, as Representative Thomas mentioned, and I think that's good. We really need that. We need the flexibility and the oversight. We need the authority to accomplish, and I mentioned that. They do have the authority to do that. And it mandates, thirdly, it mandates feedback from the actual cost of construction and also the impact over the life of the next 6 years, I believe, either 6 or 8 years. We have to document what those buildings cost, what they cost to operate, what they cost to maintain, so that we can really see the effectiveness of the program. There were some questions about specific issues that I wanted to talk just a couple of minutes more about, and that is the state-certified forest materials. The issue of having the overall sustainability process by the large groups, developed by the large groups we're talking about, the property officer, gives them the flexibility to look at this issue of the certified forest materials and determine whether those should be added into the sustainability process for Georgia. So that's what I like about the flexibility. We're not mandating, the bill doesn't mandate specifically LEED. It says here's some flexibility in doing that. Certification. The certification in some form or fashion is necessary to ensure that what the designers have indicated on the documents is built. Now, that can be done by the design professionals in the rural locations where there's not anybody else to do it. They can do it. They can be authorized to do it. As far as the level, I think silver is needed, or that level is needed. In fact, I mentioned to Representative Thomas, I wanted to consider something that would allow the levels to be raised from silver 5 years from now without having to go back and have legislative action. So if we do this, in 5 or 6 years from now, we find that this process, the sustainability process, has been a very effective, very cost-saving, the buildings are much better, we should be able to move to a higher standard if we want to do that administratively, not having to come back and do it legislatively. Looking for a couple of examples. You were asking about examples. Beyond specifically energy construction, our firm finished the project that's opened about a month ago in Forsyth County, the YMCA, a new YMCA up there. And we were looking at how we could reduce the water consumption. We understand how critical this is in the state. So the process that was added was to recycle all water from showers. If you use a YMCA, you know how many people in there taking showers. There's a lot of water consumed. That water is being recycled and used through the water closets. It's stored, filtered, and reused. And it's going to save them in the range of 500,000 gallons of water a year. And it's going to pay for itself in less than 5 years, I think, is the approximate time frame to do that. So the Y was so excited about this that they moved in the direction of using this on their future new facility. Another example here in the local area, you asked for DNR facilities. Sweetwater State Park, out northwest. I believe you go out 75 to get there. It's only, 30 minutes from here? There's a new facility out there, small facility that would be very interesting for you to go and see. And lastly, Mr. Woodall mentioned the soil or grass on the roofs of the buildings. That is an option. But you can also use a highly reflective membrane. If you ever get in a helicopter or an airplane, fly over Atlanta, look at all these black roofs. Say, why are we doing that? We should be using a silver or white, highly insulated roof to reflect the heat. And that leads you into that kind of program. So in summary, we think that the state needs to take the lead, the legislature needs to take the lead and establish a policy, establish a legislation that will implement a policy to proceed in this process. And ACEC strongly, and I do personally, strongly supports this bill and asks that you send it out to the Rules Committee at the earliest time.
Okay.
I'll try to answer any questions if you have any.
Any questions of the committee? Representative Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Getting back to, the question we were having about schools and the sites are limited that you can build schools. And in your comments, you were talking about looking at a site and the impact on the environment. I just know that through my past experience, when you get involved and start looking at a building site and its impact on the environment, things don't speed up. They slow down, especially then with EPD. So when you're saying looking at the environment, the impact that this site for, say, building a school would have, who will do that study?
That's going to be done in the design process, because your design professionals are going to go, the first thing they're going to do is look at the site that's available to use. And what we're talking about in the site analysis is the orientation of the building, the configuration of the building on the site. If there is another site available, let's consider the site. If there's not, we have to deal with the one we've already got. But all of those will be dealt with by your site planners, your civil engineer, your architect, and even the mechanical engineers, which I'm one of. The orientation and the overall planning of the building. There's a lot more planning up front in the process of developing the design of the building before the permit is ever even requested. So most of that detail, and when you have a negotiating process, no more state work is bid, state's doing some negotiating process is being used now in state work. We bring the contractor on, and during that process to establish the cost issues that might be involved in the process. So I think it'll be done up front. It should not really have any substantial impact on the permit process at all, in my opinion.
So you're saying there won't be any, it's just mainly just a process of just looking at it. So there's no possibility that you could say, well, this site will not fit our needs for this type facility.
Well, I think in general that is the correct answer. But I also say that there are certain circumstances in which you should not build the building on its site. I mean, I know of a specific one in Gwinnett County right now, and you probably know exactly which one I'm talking about, that I think the Gwinnett County school system now wishes that they hadn't built it on that site. So part of the analysis for looking at sustainability and the overall view of the project is to determine, what should we really build there? Should we really do it? And you're right, there's limited sites available, particularly in the metropolitan area now. It should be looked at more carefully during the initial design process.
Just curious about the issue of flexibility. Am I to understand that the way the bill is written, that we may there's as much flexibility to determine that maybe one particular building will use LEED standards for water conservation, another one may do something with the roof. There's not a mandate to do the whole myriad of...
The LEED standard of 69 points give you a lot of flexibility. If you go to the site, to the website, you'll see that. Mm-hmm. And there are certain that are mandated, and I don't have the list in front of me right now, and I can't speak to specifically without the list which ones are mandated in the requirements. But the options, the program is intended to be flexible. LEED is intended to be a very flexible program to give the designer and the owner, the planners, a lot of flexibility in the design. What I was talking about in the flexibility is, as I see it, the bill puts the specific responsible parties, the property officer, the Secretary of Education, and the regents, responsible for developing a sustainable policy under them.
I see.
And not specifically adopting LEED, but has the flexibility in adopting what the sustainable policy is for.
Any other questions? Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I think we also have Mr. Williams, Steve Williams from Forestry. You thought you were going to get to go first, and we put you last.
That's all right. I'm used to this position.
Okay,
That's
good
fine
deal.
with me. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Steve McWilliams, and I am with the Georgia Forestry Association. And my comments today will be more targeted, perhaps, than those that you have heard, and perhaps relate back as much as anything to Representative Buckner's questions earlier in the meeting. I guess I would start by saying that the Georgia Forestry Association certainly commends Representative Thomas for the work that he has done and for the discussion that he has begun in the process of getting the state to recognize that we need to do things differently. We need to do things better. And hopefully that discussion will go on. Don't disagree with anything that Mr. Woodall said. But there are some specific things relative to LEED and its the way that it treats and perhaps even discriminates against wood products, and more specifically Georgia wood products. But before I say that, it appears to me that if the state property officer is already in the process of developing some sustainability standards, that legislation like this might be, if anything, premature. It certainly will add to the conversation, but if we already have a process ongoing to develop these state sustainability standards, perhaps this should wait. I also would say that, to consider that you might be asked to vote on something, the LEED standard, which is very complex, which you probably know very little about, and then go to a website to learn about what you voted on would not be probably an appropriate way to deal with a legislative issue. All due respect to Mr. Johnson, what I see that he calls flexibility, as I kept hearing that term used and thinking about the legislation, seemed to be more like subjectivity. Frankly, some of these things that we see here could have such a broad impact on the state, its economy, and certain segments of its economy, which I want to address in a moment, that at the present time I would hate to let that get out of the hands of the General Assembly. Having said that, I do represent the forestry community. There are 24 million acres of commercially available forests in this state. It covers 2/3 of the state. What you probably don't know is that 92% of that is in private hands, and 80% of that is in the hands of private, non-industrial landowners who utilize their land for a variety of purposes, but most of them probably at some point in their life, maybe twice if they're lucky, are going to cut some pretty big timber off of their land, which may help send somebody to college, may help somebody retire, or whatever. But forests in this state are by and large privately owned and very important to private landowners. If you go to the Georgia Forestry Commission website, you'll see that there are 600,000 people in the state who are considered forest landowners. Now that probably includes a guy that's got 10 acres of trees, that he may use for recreation or whatever purposes, or buffer or whatever he wants to use it for. But I think a more telling figure is that there are 90,000, or in excess of 90,000, private forest landowners who own 100 acres or more. And so for them, practicing forestry is a very real thing. The forestry community is in a situation where a lot of our traditional markets are threatened, where the pulp and paper industry, as you have read, is somewhat shrinking in the state, and landowners are looking for new markets for a lot of their material. We're doing a lot of discussion, talking a lot about biofuels and biomass and that sort of thing in this legislative session, and our hope is that that's going to be a good thing, and that the legislature is going to latch on to that and develop some policy that's going to really push the use of biofuels and the use of biomass. Landowners in Georgia, like elsewhere, particularly in the southeast, are competing with subsidized Canadian wood, softwood. So anything that would put or even hint at another obstacle to Georgia's forest landowners is something that the Georgia Forestry Association has to oppose. And because of that, we stand here in opposition to House Bill 1402 today. In Mr. Thomas's comments, he mentioned that there are a number of other states that have adopted LEED at some level for certain types of construction in the state, and it was notable, unless I missed something, there was no other southeastern state or even southern state, I don't believe, I could stand corrected, that was among that list. Most of them, I think, were in the Northeast, West Coast, and that sort of thing. And I would submit to you that there is a reason for that, and that is that the southeastern part of this country is the largest wood-producing area in the world, and that landowners in the southeast and in the south in particular, where most of this wood is located, are very concerned about the limitations that the LEED standard potentially could put on southern yellow pine or any wood that's grown in the southeast. So for these reasons, we've just asked that, certainly that the debate continue, that the conversation continue. We are all for sustainable products and sustainable development and design. As a matter of fact, the Georgia Forestry Association is the host organization for the State Implementation Committee of the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, which is, for lack of a better term, a competing certification process for wood to the Forest Stewardship Council certification, FSC Wood, which is highly promoted by the LEED standard. So, we're on board with sustainability and with sustainable forestry practices, but we are not on board when we see anything that is going to possibly, potentially impact in an adverse way the thousands of people in Georgia who are producing wood for this state. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to try to answer any questions that I possibly could.
Thank you, Mr. McWilliams. Any questions from the committee?
I have one. Bearing in mind that we want our buildings to be more sustainable and to be able to be energy efficient and handle our water issues differently, and bearing in mind that we want to take care of the forestry industry in the state of Georgia, how could the two, it seems, conflicting issues come together so that we could do both?
I am aware, although I don't have the language with me and I don't recall the state, but there are some states that have dealt with this legislation. I don't believe the legislation ultimately passed, but in the process, the forestry community in the state had put some language in that precluded any standard from doing anything to impede the use of, the forest products grown locally or grown in that state. So, if you were going to pass something like this, I would certainly urge that there be language in it that makes clear that we're not promoting one forest certification over another, for example. And how you get to that, I don't know. You have to develop language. But that has happened in some states. So
the wording in the bill as it stands now, where it says state sustainability standards, the LEED Silver standard, or some other building standard, and then I think elsewhere in the bill where it talks about, I can't find it right now, but that doesn't give you that same comfort it would need.
Well, it really does. What does comparable mean? I mean, and the word equivalent was used a while ago to describe it. No, that certainly, no, that does not tie it down enough for me to make me comfortable.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you, Mr. McWilliams. Those are the only three that signed to speak. Is there someone else that wanted to make a comment from the committee? Okay. Representative Thomas, would you like to follow back up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suppose that obviously from the previous speakers, the main concerns that I have heard on the bill, and even in my discussions and are reflected in some of the changes here, the main concern that I heard in discussions was the issue of LEED and us tying our wagon to that horse of it having to be LEED. And so in discussions with Ms. Abram and others, those of us who are working on the bill, we changed the language so that we're not tying it directly to LEED necessarily, and that it opened the option for the state to come up with, and the language in the bill is comparable standards. So I think we have opened the door for a great deal of flexibility, and I certainly appreciate the concerns that the forestry industry has. There is certainly no intent on my part or any of the co-sponsors of this bill to encourage the state to somehow discriminate against locally grown lumber. And I certainly know from talking to the state property officer that there's no intention in promulgating these standards to discriminate against locally grown lumber by any means. So I appreciate the concern, but I don't think the concern I don't think the concern should be as overwhelming as it's been presented, because I think there are plenty of safeguards in here, and certainly knowing the individuals involved and who are going to be implementing this process, that those concerns are going to be addressed. I have no problems with changing some language to very specifically preclude there from being any discrimination against Georgia-grown timber in this bill. And I'd be happy to offer some language to do that, because clearly that's not our intent. I believe that there's plenty of flexibility in here already to address that, but if there are some real concerns about that, I'm very happy to put some different language in there. Obviously, that would have to happen very quickly, given the where we are in the process today.
Understood. What actually I'm wanting to do, I regret that Ms. Abrams was not able to make it. Actually, she intended to be here, but I got a call a few minutes ago that she'd gotten tied up in the governor's office and could not. And I really need to hear from Mrs. Abrams as well on the issue. And I think, frankly, the committee is not quite prepared to make the decision. On the other side, it's very fascinating. I think it has a lot of merit, and we want to try to work with you to see if we can't move forward with it. But I'm not quite sure about where the timing is at this point. We are, yes, in the end of the session, but we still have a few more days to go, and we'll try to get back together as soon as possible. So any other questions from the committee this time?
I have just one.
Certainly, go ahead.
Would the author also consider, in light of the fact that there's been so many questions about the Department of Education, since that's not exactly a state property direct, that it comes under the school boards and a lot of local, if this is an attempt to get us into doing sustainability with our state buildings, if that's going to be an issue, would you be willing for it to be restricted at this point to state buildings only, not include the schools?
Well, I'd certainly be willing to talk about that. There's a good reason why we want this to be the case with schools, and of course it doesn't apply to school buildings that are being built with local funds, entirely local funds. If that money's coming from a SPLOST, then they can construct however they like. But if it's state funds that are going to the building, then it seems to me to our state's advantage to build according to sustainability standards, but certainly would be willing to discuss that further.
I think there's
some more discussion.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at on this. I think we're all intrigued with your measure and actually encouraged that you brought along. But it's a large proposition, and those of us that don't have necessarily the technical skills, I don't know that we're yet quite prepared to move forward. Certainly, there's a pretty large expense. I'm not so sure where we get the money at this very moment that would pay for it. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is I'm not so sure how far we'll go in the system, even if this committee voted the measure out today. Number one, we're not prepared to do that, but that doesn't mean that we cannot be prepared soon. We may have to restrict your idea to certain areas of the state as sort of a pilot, more so. There's just a number of things that the committee's got to discuss to determine where we really need to go at this time. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. Meeting adjourned.